What is the difference between temptation and sin? There are many who experience guilt over the fact that they have been tempted, even when they have not done anything to violate the will of God. Furthermore, if temptation is the same as sin, then there's no use resisting temptation. So does God and the Bible make any distinction between temptation and sin? Let's investigate that question during the course of this study. First, I want us to think about the process of sin. We can learn a great deal about temptation and sin from James chapter 1 in verses 12 through 15. Let's take a few moments to consider this passage, and then we'll explore some differences between temptation and sin more thoroughly. The passage states, "Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. But each one is tempted when he is drawn away by his own desires and enticed. Then when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, brings forth death." First, James says that the man who endures temptation is blessed and will receive the crown of life that has been promised by the Lord. So it's possible to be tempted but still have God's approval. This is certainly not the case with sin. For instance, later in the passage, James plainly states that death is the end result of sin, not a crown of life. Therefore, James is making a clear distinction between temptation and sin. Second, James says that temptation is not the result of God's work. I am tempted by God is a statement that no person can accurately make. This is because God is entire holy, that is, he's separated from everything that's evil. He cannot be tempted by evil, and he cannot tempt others to do what is evil. James chapter 1, verses 16 and 17 demonstrates that every good and perfect gift is from God. So rather than God, it is Satan who is responsible for temptation. We'll talk more about that later. Third, James says that temptation occurs whenever an individual is drawn away by his or her own desires and enticed. Satan uses your own physical desires to try to lure you away from God. He presents you with opportunities to please your own physical desires and violate God's laws. It's at this point, when you are enticed by the opportunity to violate God's laws, that you're tempted. Temptation, by definition, is a trial or test between doing what's right and doing what's wrong. During a temptation, you're enticed to do wrong. Fourth, James says that sin is the result whenever the desire conceives. A desire conceives when you choose to satisfy your desire rather than being obedient to God. This is sin. It is the violation of God's law. Thus, in order for sin to occur, you must put a physical desire above being obedient to God's commandments. And fifth, James says that the end result of sin is that it brings forth death. This is spiritual death. Spiritual death is a separation from God, Isaiah 59, verses 1 and 2. It happens at the moment that you choose to commit sin. And then if an individual dies in sin, he or she will be eternally separated from God by being sentenced to eternity in hellfire. That's the second death, referred to in Revelation 21, verse 8. This is a brief overview of the process of sin. Already you can plainly observe that temptation and sin are not the same. Temptation can be overcome and the individual can have spiritual life. However, sin results in spiritual death. Now, having these fundamental truths in our minds, let's go a little deeper to understand these differences. First, temptation is the enticement to do wrong. Temptation is the tool of the devil that Satan uses to try to lure you away from God. Matthew 4 and verse 3 says that the tempter came to Jesus, and clearly the one who accomplished these temptations was identified as being Satan. And you can go into Matthew 4 and read verse 5 and verse 8 and verse 10, and you can see that. And when you read this passage, you discover that Satan was doing exactly what James described regarding temptation. He was appealing to Jesus' physical desires in order to entice him. On this occasion, he presented Jesus with 3 opportunities to do wrong. Now, we'll come back to Matthew chapter 4 and the temptations of Jesus a bit later. For now, let's continue to see how the Bible presents temptations by looking at some examples of temptation. First, let's consider the first temptation we can read about in the Bible. In Genesis 3, Satan, who took the form of a serpent on this occasion, went to Eve and tried to entice her in a physical desire. God had commanded her, as well as Adam, not to eat of or touch the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He promised that they would die in the day they ate of it. Yet the devil said in verses 4 and 5, "You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." And at this point, Eve was presented with the opportunity to do wrong and was enticed by her physical desire. She saw that the tree was good for food, as you go into verse 6, that it was pleasant to the eyes and a tree desirable to make her wise. A second example is in Genesis chapter 4. Cain and Abel both made sacrifices to God. However, God only respected the offering that was made by Abel, and this made Cain angry. And then consider what God told Cain in verse 7. He says, "And if you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you shall rule over it." He was tempted. Sin was at the door. He hadn't yet committed sin, but he had been presented with the opportunity. Third, another example comes from Genesis chapter 39, and it records the story of Joseph during his time as head of Potiphar's house. At this time, Potiphar's wife desired to convince Joseph to commit adultery with her, and she tried to entice Joseph, saying, "Lie with me," as verse 7 records. Verse 10 says, "So it was as she spoke to Joseph day by day that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her." Joseph was presented the opportunity to do wrong on a daily basis. At one point, she even grabbed Joseph's garment, saying, "Lie with me." While there are many other examples we could consider regarding temptation, these 3 examples from the book of Genesis are sufficient to help us understand the nature of temptation. One of the things you should be impressed with at this point in our study is the fact that temptation can be resisted. Go back and consider each one of these 3 examples. None of them were put into a position in which they could not choose to do what was right. They were simply being lured into doing what was wrong when Satan appealed to them through their physical desires. The scriptures are clear that it is possible to resist temptation. Recall that James 1 and verse 12 referenced the one who endures temptation. Later, James 4 verse 7 instructs, "Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you." And regarding the desires, particularly in young men, to commit sexual sins, Paul instructed Timothy to flee youthful lusts. And I want you to look at 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. It makes it abundantly clear that God provides a way of escape, that is, a way to do what's right, to be victorious over every temptation. He says, "No temptation has overtaken you, except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it." Temptation is very clearly not the same as sin. If temptation was equal to sin, it would not matter whether you found the way of escape. You would already be guilty of sin and deserve spiritual death. Furthermore, if temptation was equal to sin, Jesus sinned. Recall from Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, that the scriptures record 3 temptations of Jesus. Yet he did not allow his desires to conceive. Instead, he chose to do the will of God. In fact, this is always how Jesus responded to temptation. Therefore, Hebrews 4 verse 15 says that Jesus was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Jesus was tempted, but Jesus did not sin. You see, sin is actually doing wrong. Temptation results in an internal struggle between good and evil, and Paul describes this conflict in Romans chapter 7, verses 21 through 25. He says, "I find then a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man, but I see another law in my members, warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin which is in my members. O wretched man that I am! Who will deliver me from this body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh the law of sin. In Galatians chapter 5 and verse 17, Paul said, For the flesh lusts against the spirit, and the spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. Every person who has ever reached the age of moral accountability has experienced this conflict and has lost at least one of these battles. Romans 3 verse 23 says, For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. The temptation presented the opportunity to commit sin, yet it is whenever an individual gives in to the temptation and violates the law of God, he or she actually commits sin. This is because sin, by biblical definition, is acting against or contrary to God's law. For instance, 1 John 3 and verse 4 says, Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. 1 John 5 verse 17 says, All unrighteousness is sin. And James 4 verse 17 says, Therefore to him who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. Now briefly consider the three examples we studied from Genesis again. Eve was tempted to take of the forbidden fruit, yet she had not committed sin until she took of its fruit and ate. Verse 6. Cain was told that sin was at the door and desired for him, but he needed to rule over it. Yet when Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and killed him, he committed sin. Genesis 4, verse 8. Finally, Joseph was tempted to commit adultery with Potiphar's wife. Yet Joseph asked in Genesis 39, verse 9, How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? And verse 12 records how he fled from her when she took hold of his garment. Therefore, even though Joseph was tempted on this occasion, he did not commit sin. The Bible makes a clear distinction between temptation and sin. Temptation is the enticement to do evil. Sin is actually doing the evil. Therefore, you must be diligent in overcoming Satan's temptations by finding and taking the way of escape God provides. If you do not, you too will experience spiritual death.